Kathy Brown, who is director of the Trafalgar Way, and we're going to be firstly transported back to 1805. So welcome.
Thank you, Sue. So just to set the scene, I've been introduced as director of the Trafalgar Way. Sounds quite grand. The Trafalgar Way, many people will start off by asking, well, what is it? Well, it is an initiative of a charity called the 1805 Club. I'll be telling you a little bit more about how they inaugurated the Trafalgar Way back in 2005. Some of you might actually remember the occasion and might actually have attended some of the events back then. But after it was created, there was a hiatus where the plaques they'd erected along the length of the route were all there was really to show for it, and nothing much more was done. Luckily for me, in 2017, the 1805 Club came into some grant funding and decided to appoint somebody to lift the Trafalgar Way and give it breathe some new life into it, and hopefully create something that will end up lasting for many generations. So that's what I've been busy doing for the past few years. And the second thing I always tell people when they ask, well, what is the Trafalgar Way? I haven't even told you where it is yet, but what is it? Well, it's an absolutely fantastic story. It's not a fictional story, it is a true story based on history. Like all great stories, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Although for this one, you have to rewind even further, because to appreciate the beginning of the story, you need to understand the context for what was happening in Britain in 1805. So we're in the Napoleonic period, and it really helps to try and understand what the mood was like in Britain at that time. Now, hopefully most of you will know that we connect Trafalgar with a celebrity from the time, Vice Admiral Lord Nelson. And he truly was, back then, a real celebrity, because there was a sense in Britain of trepidation. There was genuine threat that Napoleon was planning to invade British shores. As he hadn't happened for a few hundred years where there'd been that kind of threat, but now, again, it was a real possibility. And so, in the way of the media, they like to report on things with a sense of perhaps exaggeration or fantasy. And in this case, there were fears being expressed that enemy might arrive on our shores by air, because hot air balloon had only recently been invented as a form of transport. They naturally assumed that Napoleon's troops would be transported by barges, multiple barges, that he had at the ready over on the other side of the channel. And some crazy harebrained people had this idea that he might dig a tunnel under the channel, which is a preposterous idea from the time. But it was true, he was amassing troops over in Boulogne, and he had obviously international troops and international backing. There was the threat from the land, but to support him to do that, he needed the support of his navy, and he had effectively forced the Spanish navy to work with him as well. And so what Britain was facing was a threat of this combined navy lending support to this effort to get troops across the channel, and who knows what ensued afterwards. Now it happens that before the Battle of Trafalgar actually took place, other things then distracted Napoleon. He lost patience waiting for his fleet to turn up and do that in the channel to give him that support, and so he sent the troops away again. But Nelson, meanwhile, had been sent out to go and harry the enemy, look out for them, and put an end to what they were trying to do in the channel. So there was a bit of a chase across the Atlantic. The French Admiral Villeneuve and the Spanish Admiral Gravina had been heading over to the Caribbean. Turns out Nelson got there first. And when they realised they were going to have no joy over there, they turned around and came back again. And there was a bit of a chase going on. Nelson then came back to Britain, and that's where his famous last few days were spent with Emil Hamilton up at in Morden. And his famous last walk down to join Victory at Portsmouth in September of 1805. I'm not going to dwell on the events of Trafalgar. If it's something that you really want to understand about the sequence of events and how the battle took place, then I do encourage you to visit the 1805 Club website, and you'll find various articles about that. And of course, we've got some on our website as well, briefly explaining, and some blog posts about it. So what had happened, the French and the Spanish fleets had found themselves holed up in Cadiz harbour. Now, shockingly, you ask people, do you know where Trafalgar is? And depending on their age or, I guess, education, quite often they'll say, isn't it that place in the middle of London with a big bloke on a statue? They might otherwise go, is it somewhere, isn't it in Belgium or somewhere like that? Of course, muddling it all up with Waterloo. But as we know, Trafalgar is a little rocky cape on the south coast of Spain, not far from the Straits of Gibraltar. Cadiz was a popular harbour, nice and safe and hidden away for the Spanish fleet in particular. We've had lots of battles of Cadiz. If you go and look up the Battle of Cadiz, you'll find there are several for that reason. It was quite a difficult place to be holed up, though, because the hinterland around Cadiz makes it quite difficult to get lots of provisions in for lots of sailors and ships and crews. So Villeneuve and his lot had been there after they'd been over the Atlantic, and they were waiting their chance to pop out and get into the Mediterranean to some other place of safety. However, Nelson had received word that that's where they were, so he was laying siege to them in Cadiz harbour. And he had with him his 26, it was on Victory, of course, he was the captain, the flag admiral on HMS Victory, and he had 26 other ships of the line with him, and was supported by a number of smaller vessels, frigates that were used for scouting and relaying messages, and smaller vessels such as HMS Pickle, who we're going to meet shortly. In the course of the Battle of Trafalgar, Villeneuve comes out of Cadiz, sees the sails of Nelson and Collingwood off on the horizon, moving very slowly because it was a very calm day, panics, sends a message to turn around and go back into Cadiz, and it's at that point in that disarray where Nelson finally manages to break through their line, and the first shots were fired at about midday on the 21st of October in 1805. So we know that in the afternoon, in the height of the battle, Vice Admiral Nelson is killed. And this is just a few shots to show you. I suspect that some of you might have visited Cape Trafalgar on the seaside, but if you haven't seen it, this is some views of what it looks like on the land side. And this is looking up towards Cadiz. This is looking out, and there's a lighthouse there because, of course, the shoals off Trafalgar are still quite dangerous around there. And so that's what that looks like. Wasn't that beautiful and calm on the day? There was a swell building, and in fact, after the battle, an enormous storm came up. So it wasn't for another 5 days that Vice Admiral Collingwood, who stepped in to be in command after Nelson had been killed, was able to get his dispatches ready to send back with his report of the battle. Now, part of the narrative around what had happened in the course of the battle was that his own vessel, Royal Sovereign, had been damaged. So he had to shift his flag to another ship, and the one he chose to move it to was a frigate called Euryalus, which was captained by a guy called Captain Blackwood. Now, Captain Blackwood had been the original favourite to bring home the dispatches from the battle. So Nelson, if he had been around and there had been a victory to report, would have given that job to Blackwood. But because Collingwood was sitting on Euryalus, which, by the way, was built at down the road at Buckler's Hard. So that's one of those. He had to find somebody else to do the job. He had to let the Admiralty know about the outcome of the battle, the fact that the Commander-in-Chief had been killed, the state of the number of casualties that had been sustained, the state of the other ships of the line, and the damage that had been sustained there, and about the prizes that had been captured, and all of that was an immensely important message, quite detailed. So the person that he selected to carry the news home was a chap that he knew quite well, had come across in previous missions and commands, and he was the commander of one of the smallest vessels, HMS Pickle. Lieutenant John Richards Lapenotiere, with his very difficult to say French name, had been commander of Pickle for a few years, had been deployed acting as a carrier of communications, but also as a kind of little taxi service, so ferrying people from one vessel to another. After the battle itself, they had moved prisoners out of one ship and into another. He had been part of the lookout crew with Euryalus and the frigates, going and spying on what was happening in Cadiz Harbour before. Collingwood really trusted Lapenotiere. He was known as a very dependable person. There's also rumour that they had experienced some peril on a previous ship, and that Lapenotiere's swift action had saved the day, and that therefore Collingwood thought, here's somebody I can now reward by giving him this very important mission. Now, being the bearer of dispatches was very prestigious. I mean, it was a huge responsibility. You only had one copy of this message. Anything could happen on the way. You had to keep it dry for a start. You had enemy vessels that would still be encountered on the way, and to thank you for safely getting news of a battle back to the Admiralty, you were going to be faced with a fairly generous reward. So it was definitely a job worth having. Lapenotiere was French because he was of Huguenot extraction. He'd been born in North Devon, in Ilfracombe, in 1770, and he would have learned his early sailing craft, his career there. He actually learned alongside his father as well, or under the tutelage of his father, who was also a naval officer, and his grandfather had been in the army. So there were actually 4 generations since they'd come over in the train of William of Orange to seek protection in Britain, who had served the British monarchy. So he was very, very British in that respect. But the poor man had a continuous record of being misrepresented in terms of how his name was spelt, and I'm sure how it was pronounced, whoever he met and wherever he went. So there are records where you think it's him. It must be him. The commander of Pickle, but he's called La Fontaine. He's called La Pontière. I mean, you can imagine all sorts of spellings, even in the official naval records. But we can put together a sort of curriculum vitae of all of his accomplishments. So definitely, he was a good guy. And I always put this here so we know how to pronounce it. Interestingly, he didn't put accents on his name, and when he signed his name, I think he thought, it's hard enough. Let's not make it any more complicated. So he would have been given the dispatches in a watertight portmanteau or satchel, would have been sealed, and Collingwood told him expressly, you are to take these and to use every possible effort to and every exertion to deliver these messages safely to the Admiralty in London. He was under no illusion that he was being relied upon. He was also told that if there was any danger that the dispatches might fall into the wrong hands, that he was to throw them overboard straight away, rather than allow them to get into enemy hands. So that's a bit of context. Now, this storm, which had raged after the Battle of Trafalgar, had endangered many lives. It had been an absolutely a critical storm. They'd lost some of their captured ships, and many men drowned in the storm. In fact, almost as many as were injured or killed during the battle itself. So the conditions as they headed back towards English shores were really challenging. Now, this is one of the famous paintings of HMS Pickle. This one by an artist called Gordon Frickers, who was the artist in residence on HMS Victory about 20 years ago. He has a series of Pickle paintings. I am not going to tell you very much about HMS Pickle because I strongly urge you to come and listen to the talk in a few weeks' time by your colleague Jeremy Vines. Jeremy knows HMS Pickle's story extremely well and could tell you a lot more accurately than I could about its lines, its abilities, and I guess how it had come to be in this role as a vessel. But suffice to say, it was small. They had a crew of 42. The muster list at Trafalgar was numbered 42. These guys were from different countries. There were several Irishmen. There were some Americans. The ship's master was an American called Almy. They even had a Norwegian as one of their crew. And it was not very comfortable. It was because of where the ship had been built and the fact that it was actually a schooner. It's low to the water, and so battling through it wasn't really designed for battling through the Bay of Biscay on a horrible day in late October. So it would have been pretty horrible on that journey, and it was actually a very dangerous journey for them, as the ship's log tells us. At one point, they were forced to jettison 4 of their small guns, their carronades, overboard. They had to bail out several times and pump out water from the ship. So, on their journey, the first thing they had to do was they had to go around Cape St. Vincent. And there, when they came around Cape St. Vincent, they met another vessel. It was a British ship, another small ship, a brig, called HMS Nautilus. And the captain of Nautilus, a gentleman called Commander Sykes, had been instructed by Nelson personally to stay there, stationed off Cape St. Vincent, to act as a go-between, to pass on messages, and when the ships were all originally coming down to meet him near Cadiz, to tell them where he was. And and they had to sign a log to say they'd received these orders, and so we know about this. He'd been told to stay there until he had further orders. So when La Penotière came up with the flags signals saying, possibly, we're speculating here, but possibly with flags that saying, I am carrying dispatches, he would have been very curious. He knew that there would have been action, and he was the superior officer. So ordinarily, you would have expected him to have instructed La Penotière to get in his little cutter, his little boat, and go across to Nautilus and appraise him of everything that happened. But it turns out, we know from the log, La Penotière didn't do that. He insisted that Sykes come on board Pickle, and they kept going. So it's like they fell in together and carried on northwards while La Penotière briefed Sykes on the events of what had happened. And he instructed Sykes, he said, Collingwood has told me that you are to go into Lisbon and to act as a backup to give this news to the ambassador in Lisbon and ensure that it's transmitted overland to London in case anything should befall me on the way. You can imagine that Sykes might have been a little bit put out. He was also a very seasoned dispatches carrier, and when Nelson had interrupted him and told him to stay put off Cape St Vincent, he'd actually been on his way carrying dispatches north to London at that time, and Nelson said, no, you stay here, we'll get us another vessel to go and take those back. I want you to do this. So he must have been a bit irked that La Penotière and Pickle had been given this huge honour. So Pickle carries on north. To their surprise, in the log book, the following morning, they see sails aft on the horizon, and La Penotière would have realised that actually Sykes hasn't gone into Lisbon. He's turned and is following them, and wondered what on earth was going on. Well, we know that they were neck and neck for a while, and then as they go round Finisterre, that Sykes and Nautilus have pulled ahead, being a slightly faster and slightly bigger vessel. They were able to pull ahead, and the weather then closed in, and it all got a little bit more confusing. They're having to pay attention to what they're doing on their own vessels. He lost track of him, so from that point on, he doesn't see Sykes again. He meets another ship on the way back. He has to decide where he's going to put in. Now, this is an interesting point of speculation. Ordinarily, Pickle would have been moored. His home was at Plymouth. It used to be in Stonehouse Pool, which is an old harbour of Plymouth, old Plymouth. And the commander-in-chief of the Channel Fleet, Admiral Young, was based at Plymouth. He was effectively La Penotière's boss. And so there's a question mark over why he chose, in fact, to go ashore at Falmouth. Now, shortly before arriving, around the time they entered the Channel, the weather completely changed. So all of that storminess, that wind, just like fell away. And again, as sailing folk, you are probably familiar with this, the weather that we've got at the moment, this autumnal weather that we have, where you often get a high pressure system over southern England, and it can be very still. You can get, in fact, a prevailing wind coming from the northeast, and so it can make progress up the Channel very difficult if there is a wind at all. And in fact, we know again from Pickle's log that at that point of their journey, there was no wind, and the men were forced to get on the sweeps and row to try and to make some progress towards land. Now, whether it was just from the point of view of speed, whether it was because La Penotière feared that if he went into harbour at Plymouth, he would be detained. He might have been forced to hand over the job of actually carrying on to London to somebody else. He might have been required to go into quarantine. Something we all know something about these days. Or whether there were other reasons. I mean, Falmouth itself would have been known to him. He would have used Falmouth from time to time. It's a very famous, deep, natural harbour. And guess what? The harbour master in Falmouth is a gentleman who was from Ilfracombe, who he would have known. He had been given the task of preparing moorings in Falmouth for any captured enemy vessels. So La Penotière probably knew about that, and put all these things together, and he felt justified in going into Falmouth, not Plymouth, knowing that he would be able to make his way to London overland from there, and that it would have been quicker than trying to make any further progress up the channel. So let's give him that. So when he arrives in Falmouth, he has to get the fastest way he possibly can overland to London. Now, in those days, we are just on the eve, we're just at the start of the Industrial Revolution. So, of course, we've got no motor vehicles, we've got no aeroplanes or helicopters. And the fastest way to travel was using the power of the wind when you were at sea, or in the air, in a hot air balloon. Or over land, it was by horse. Now, people often say, why didn't he ride that way? Well, goodness me, can you imagine having gone all that time at sea, all through that battle, laboured through those storms, all the way back? You're carrying very, very important message. The idea of jumping on a horse and trying to gallop to London would be just impractical, and also not very fitting for a naval officer. And it would have been the normal practice for them to hire one of these carriages, which is called a post chaise. And our term for post, and for this form of transport are connected. Posting was the practice of travelling in a carriage from one inn to another. And the government, the state had set up designated known posting stops. So, we have a great many coaching inns, and we know when you walk around any town or village, you can see the archway in a pub, and that's where the stables would have been out the back. Of course, a lot of people would have had their own private carriages and horses and drivers. And there would have been the stagecoaches as well, so the bus system, if you like. And this fell somewhere in between. So a post chaise was the early 19th century, late 18th century equivalent of a high-speed taxi service. And he would have known that if you wanted to travel between any 2 points, A and B, on mainland Britain, that the posting system would have been the fastest way to do that, because posting requires the horses to be kept in pairs, and each is looked after by a post boy or postilion. The reason that they're so fast is because the postilions are driving them by sitting on the near-side horses. They're always in pairs, and there would always be some ready at these posting inns. So, as I say, it wouldn't be every pub in every town. It would be specific ones. So, with some certainty, we can say that we know where La Penotière would have changed horses as he then pursued his journey east and north up to London. So, another aspect of these was, so you could have 2 horses pulling it, but to go faster you would have 4, or to make it more secure you would have 4, because you can only ever go as fast as the slowest horse. Okay, so that is a limitation, but nevertheless this was the fastest way to go. The carriage itself was allegedly quite comfortable because it's slung on leather straps, and so as you go along the rutted pre-ironed roads of that period, you're more likely to be swayed around than jolted. And it was said that as a passenger in one of these, and you could only fit 2, maybe 3 people in at any one time, as a passenger, that you might be made to feel a bit seasick. Well, luckily La Pinocchier's got sea legs, so he can cope. The poor man must have had to grab whatever sleep he could on the course of that journey, because he had to change horses at least 21 times on that journey, and he didn't stop. He left Falmouth. We know that he went ashore on the morning of the 4th of November, and we know how long it took him to make the journey, and altogether it was about 38 hours. So grabbing catnaps, I guess. Horses can only go 10 to 15 miles before they become exhausted on with that sort of load. So that means that equates to about an hour and a half. Can you imagine? So he would have got in, been rocked off to sleep. Next thing, he'd have to get out, get in the next one. There might have been a 5-minute or 10-minute pause while they changed over the horses. He might have had to change carriage when they get to the county borders, because the post chases would have been the property of probably their posting in Inky, or a particular company that would have owned them. And so he wouldn't have had a chance to get much rest. I guess he would have leapt out for comfort breaks, and he would have grabbed a bite to eat wherever he could from the inns as he went. How do we know? How do we know his route? So we have some sources. The most important is, and this is what sparked off the Trafalgar Way, was that a member of the 1805 Club, who's a writer and historian, a chap called Peter Hoare, was doing some research in the naval archives, and he found this document, which is the actual receipt signed La Pinocchierre from that journey, and it lists the coach change places where he would have changed horses, and the amounts that he owed on account, or the Navy owed on account. We're not quite sure whether he would have actually, if there was a way that he could have carried enough cash or gold to pay for it, because this amounts to almost £50 in that time's money, which is would have been about half a year's salary for him. So maybe about £4,500. So whether he was able to, when he landed in Falmouth, go to some kind of treasurer who would give him that money in gold to spend on the way, or whether it was a case of promissory notes along the way, and then the Navy would reimburse those inns later on, that we don't know. But those were the amounts. We also have the very first Ordnance Survey. So Ordnance Survey, you may know, began in the Napoleonic period. They started mapping England in preparation in case there was an invasion. And they started in Kent and moved along the south coast in that direction. So by the time La Pinocchierre was landing in November 1805, there weren't any Ordnance Survey maps. There might have been these, which were road strip maps and used by coach drivers to navigate, where, as you see, north changes direction, depending on which bit of road you're on. But it's still a useful form of navigation. And then we have this book, which is a coachman's guide called Patterson's Roads, and there are various editions of it, but it gave the routes, the names of inns, the distances in miles from London, and it mapped the whole country in terms of what the coaching routes were, but using words rather than maps and images. So putting these together with this, we've got a pretty clear idea of the route that was taken, and I have actually personally gone along Google on a current day map of roads and superimposed and drawn over, using the old series original OS maps, what that route would have been. So there's a few blips where it deviates from today's trunk roads, because, you know, we built nice sort of straight and looping curves around hills, and they weren't quite so well engineered back then. So, what were the conditions like on the journey? Well, it was beginning of November. You know what it's like on sort of bonfire night? Well, strangely enough, guess what date it was? He'd landed in Falmouth on the 4th of November, and it took him 38 hours. So his journey took place right through bonfire night. And you can imagine it would have been still, it would have been foggy, maybe a bit mild. Now we know from other naval logs, maritime logs of the time, that it hadn't rained at that point for a few weeks. So it wouldn't have been muddy and boggy as he went. It would have been quite rutted probably and dry. So he was saved that at least. But this idea of bonfire night, well, funnily enough, that year, it wasn't just that it was that day that was the Guy Fawkes Day. You might think, well, did they even celebrate it then? Who knows, you know. But 1805 was exactly 200 years from the gunpowder plot. So and they did celebrate it, because we know even quite soon after, from the time of King James, that they were lighting bonfires and burning effigies of Catholics on the bonfires, you know. So maybe he witnessed people gathering and building bonfires in the towns that he passed through on the way. So here we are. I mean, lots of towns. You know, you've got all of those. You've got Exeter, you've got Dorchester and Honiton, and here, as he went through on the 5th, he would have gone through Blandford and Salisbury and Andover. And when he got to Andover, Overton and Basingstoke, it would have been dusk. People could have been out carousing in the streets. It's nice to imagine that's what he saw from his carriage window. Now you may be wondering, what happened to that guy Sykes? I bet Le Penotier was wondering what had happened to Sykes as well, thinking, why did he turn around and follow me? That was really annoying. Well, it transpires that there wasn't just one man in a post-chase on his way across the roads of southern England on that day. There were two. And not just any two. Sykes had actually followed him or travelled separately all the way back to England, had gone into Plymouth, had gone to see Admiral Young, had explained the news and what he'd heard, the verbal rendition of the news, been given permission to proceed, since it was him that had heard it firsthand from La Penotier, all the way to London. And so he had an authorisation from Admiral Young to carry on. And spurred on by, was it the duty of knowing that he was providing a backup in case something had happened? Because of course, Admiral Young at that point hadn't seen hide nor hair of La Penotière. Well, actually, well, the day that Sykes arrives in Plymouth with the news, Pickle also arrives in Plymouth because when La Penotière sets off from Falmouth, he tells his sub-lieutenant to take Pickle round to Plymouth. And so just after, or around the same time, or just after, Pickle will have arrived there as well. But meanwhile, Sykes has been given permission to go off in a post-chase and four, no expense spared, don't what's the word, hold back the horses, and off you go. Now, we know, it's even more exciting than that they weren't just two carriages going along several hours apart. They were literally an hour apart from each other on that journey. And we know this because a letter was written by a naval officer who was in Dorchester and witnessed them both coming through. He said, at about midday, no more than an hour apart, two post-chases, each with 4 horses, came in from the west. And in the first was a naval officer who declared that he had the most capital news that the nation had ever heard. And in the second was an officer who said he was carrying dispatches of the utmost importance. So we can also start to try and imagine who was first, who was second at that point. It sounds like, and if you think about it, it sounds like maybe Sykes was ahead. His route would have come up from Plymouth and joined just west of Exeter, so just near Oakhampton. So they would have been sharing the same route for quite a while. And you think it might have been Sykes ahead and La Penotière second, because if Sykes knew that another officer was already ahead of him at each time when he changed horses on that route, why would he have carried to race so fast? Because he must have known that it would have been La Penotière, and La Penotière had the dispatches. So I love to think that Sykes was ahead, La Penotière's behind him going, confound that man! He can't get there first, I've got the dispatches! But what we do know is that shortly after 1 a.m, there's a knock at the door, hammering at the door of the Admiralty, and a servant lets in a naval officer and shows him up the stairs. And the first secretary of the Admiralty is still up working by candlelight. They're busy guys, and had a lot of work on. Anyway, so he was just off to bed. News was delivered to Marsden. Marsden goes and wakes up Barham, who is the First Lord of the Admiralty and has already gone to bed. He's an old fella, he's already gone to bed. And debriefs him. They talk for a while. They call for the scribes, to the clerks, to do all the transcripts. They get the press releases out to the London Gazette. They get a copy drafted of the news sent over to the King at Windsor Castle. They get a copy sent to Pitt, the Prime Minister, to let him know what's happened. And of course, it's a story of both great joy, because it was so significant that Napoleon had been trounced, but so sad that the nation had lost this great hero. And if it were a younger audience, we usually say, imagine if it was Harry Kane or Harry Styles, biggest celebrity you can imagine, who'd gone off to war and then led this battle to victory but been killed. So hugely momentous. Poor old La Penotière, you'd like to think, was then allowed to go and get a bit of kip. But we know that the next morning at about 7 or 8 o'clock, he and Sykes were both sitting out waiting to be debriefed again. And Sykes was effectively sent away with a flea in his ear because he didn't have permission to do all of that, to leave his post, where Nelson had commanded him to stay there, and off we'd gone. He went back to Plymouth. La Penotière hangs around in London and actually goes round to Robert Dodds, an artist, around the corner, and gives a description of the events of Trafalgar. So one of the first graphical depictions can be painted or etched straight away. Equivalent of, we haven't got photographs, so we can't just like sort of text a photograph over now. You've got to send your messenger 9 days at sea, 38 hours by carriage, and he has to verbally describe what happened. So it's a complete other world. So, what happened next? In 2003 or so, when it was known there was going to be some bicentenary celebrations for the Battle of Trafalgar, a group of historians, including members of the 1805 Club, got together and said, French have got La Route Napoleon, Americans have Paul Revere's Ride, why don't we mark Trafalgar and put it into national memory? Obviously, there's obviously Nelson's column and other Nelson memorials, but why don't we have a Trafalgar Way, the route of the messenger, because we know where he went. And so they set about this amazing reenactment and celebration of the route. A yellow post chase was built, commissioned and built specially. It was built actually in Poland, but it's still here in Britain today. And some of you who were at the Cornwallis Remembered event 2 years ago will have seen that post chase as well. This is a reenactor from the time, Alex, who played the role of La Penotière, and they took the whole summer to go from Falmouth to London, unveiling plaques, having lovely commemorations, and there were different dinners and different concerts were held all along the route. So we're continuing the tradition. So there are 39 plaques. There were 38, but in 2018 we unveiled a new one in Perranwell in Cornwall because we discovered the route had gone that way through the village, and money was raised to have a plaque up there as well. It's on the pub there, and the post chasing horses came down as well. Here we are. Some photographs taken by somebody you might know called Paul French. And here is another one of our actors. This is a costume that we had made with some of our funding, so that we've got one of our own. We don't have to hire them anymore. We've got one, and we've got three people who fit into it, at least. So and we've had some new hats made as well now. Not that one. In different hat sizes because different La Penotières have different sized heads. There's somewhere you might recognise. Obviously, we have a website. We have, the interactive map on the website, so people can go and click around on it and see different things. We've created educational resources, worksheets that teachers and parents or informal educators can download and learn about. We kicked off a programme of hospitality along the Trafalgar Way because the history of coaching is so tied up with the whole story. Being a route, it lends itself really, really well to people who want to have fun doing journeys. And whether that's just a case of plaque spotting, so we have several people who've either cycled looking at all of the plaques along the route, or driven in cars. I tell people that if they send me photographs or they tell me that they've done it, we've got a roll of honour on the website that people can be added to.
Thank you enormously. Thank you.